So, an intro to internal family systems. So, IFS for short was developed by Richard Schwartz in the 1980s. And Dick was working with clients that had eating disorders. It was almost like these different aspects of the psyche were performing different functions. So, what Dick realized is that our subconscious is a multiplicity of subpersonalities. And now neuroscience is starting to actually prove to us what the yogis have known for a really, really long time. But basically, our ego self are all of these different parts, and that these parts all have specific functions and roles to play within our psychological system. Now, a really important premise of this model is that all parts of us are good and all parts are trying to help in some way. Sometimes parts might have like some outdated software or something like that, but every single aspect of the psyche is inherently good and trying to do its function to the best of its ability with the limited information that it might have. Now, the other part of the model is what we call the self, capital S self, which is the core of the person. And it contains leadership qualities such as compassion, perspective, curiosity, confidence. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And the self is best equipped to lead the system of parts. So we really want to be identified with this self energy or this center of consciousness. And we want our parts to be functioning when they need to be, but not over functioning. So parts are actually neural pathways in the brain. Something we get triggered, we use that language, we get triggered. Like what gets triggered? It's the prefrontal cortex with the logic and decision making. And then we have like the midbrain, which is the amygdala, the emotional center of the brain. And then we have the brain stem, which is the nervous system. So a neural pathway is going to get activated at the level of thought, of cognitive thought, at the level of emotion, and of the level of sensation or feeling. Okay, so they are the neural pathway that activates in the whole person. And these parts of us developed to help us to cope with our life circumstances, help us survive, help us cope. They develop to protect us from harm or from discomfort. They also have the purpose of some parts have to get things done and like manage things in our lives. Other parts have the roles of kind of motivating us to do our best or trying to protect us in some way. Also bringing pleasure or relief might be the function of a part, or some parts have the job of kind of distracting us from painful experiences or feelings or memories or beliefs. So here are some examples of some common parts. And parts can be named anything. Parts can have multiple jobs. But when I'm first introducing this model to people, it's kind of nice to have this overview of these parts. And I'd like for you right now, if you're willing, to maybe just take a little note as you look at this list, if there are any parts of you that you really identify with that are on this particular list. So I'm just going to give you a moment to do that. So when parts do their jobs well, then everything runs smoothly. But when parts work too hard, they can become really burdened. They can get imbalanced or extremed. They can kind of get locked into their role where they can't stop doing the job that they're doing. And they can sometimes just take over the whole field. And that should say field and not filed there. And that third bullet point, sorry. A part can kind of take over the whole living room of consciousness and really squash out any of our core self energy. And parts can certainly get polarized with other parts. We see in these images by Sharon Eckstein, who is the artist for the interactive cards. And you can go to interactivecards.com to actually get a deck of these parts cards. They're fantastic. I work with them with clients all the time. And so if we've got two parts in the living room, one that's really burdened with helping and one that's really burdened with all these other tasks, you can see how this could be really problematic for someone. And like the last bullet point says, it can cause us to burn out. Let's talk about self energy now. So Dick actually gives these qualities of self leadership. Like we know that we are more anchored in that centered self or that core consciousness when we exhibit certain qualities. And those qualities are feelings, they're experienced in the entire system, neural system. And that's a feeling of being centered, a feeling of being calm and clear, This is my favorite one, curious. Self never has an agenda. Self never has an assumption. It's always just open to possibility. It's always curious, deeply compassionate, very confident, courageous, creative, and that feeling of connectedness is there. So we know that we are anchored in that centered self when we are exhibiting, usually at least two or three of these qualities in the moment. Okay, so when self leads the system, then the parts can really trust that feeling of gratitude that self has for how hard that they work, that sense of compassion that self might have for a part, for the painful job that it has. Maybe it's, got to carry really painful memories. Maybe it's a part that has to do what I call a shit job, like it's a dirty job, but somebody's got to do it. But when we start to come into relationship from self with these parts, and we can be grateful towards them for how hard they're working or the tough job that they have, we can have compassion towards them when they are suffering or burdened in some way. And when the parts start to recognize the self presence in the system, then the parts can relax a little bit and they don't have to be so extreme in their role. When self is leading the system, the parts can do their jobs at appropriate times, and then they can step back when they're not so needed to do those jobs. When self is leading the system, parts can be open to new possibilities and shift out of disempowering beliefs or perspectives. So that's that sense of curiosity. It's like, oh, what other possibility might exist besides what I'm believing is true right now? Like self can propose that question, like what other possibility might exist besides what I think is happening that's causing this trigger or this reaction in me? And then the last one that I have here in this bullet is when self is leading the system, then the parts can really make space for other parts to have some expression, and they can kind of work in harmony with each other instead of working in this kind of polarized way that they sometimes do. And we hear that in our language system all the time. There's this part of me that really wants to do this, but there's this other part of me that really wants to do that, or feels guilty about this, or whatever it is, like these two sides that we find ourselves kind of feeling simultaneously. So when self leaves the system, there's more harmony and there's more cooperation internally.